I'm going to call the meeting to order. I declare the meeting is now open to the public. Today our committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings as well as online. There are 4 members attending the meeting today, 2 in person, myself, the Chair, Emma Sheeran and Michelle McIlveen, and we've got Mark H. Durkin and Joan O'Dowd, who's attending in his capacity as Carol Nicholls' deputy over Starleaf. So we don't have quorum, but we can take evidence sessions. So the first item on the agenda is apologies, and we've got apologies from Mike Nesbitt, from Paula Bradshaw and from Christopher Stalford, who is still ill, I believe. The second item then on our agenda is a briefing from Baroness Kennedy. So I think Baroness Kennedy has had some technical difficulties and we haven't got her yet. So if members are content, we'll skip through to the third item on our agenda, which is a briefing from Albie Sachs, who's the former Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. And Albie is with us via video conference as well, and he said that he's happy to go ahead and proceed with this briefing. Albie's joining us from Cape Town today, so welcome him to the meeting, and thank you very much for being so flexible, Albie. If you want to begin.
Oh, he's muted, I think.
You must
hold on,
be
it might
muted.
be
We can't
broadcast.
hear you.
No, he should. Is it muted at his end?
Am I muted? Is that the problem?
No. Oh, yeah, he's muted. Just ask broadcast into. Oh, I think. Yeah, that's it now.
Oh, here. We have left off.
Just tell them you're setting up your earphones.
Okay, I'm just attending to the
Earphones.
earphones.
Okay, no problem.
The other pair wasn't working so well. Will you try this one?
Technology can be a difficult thing.
Could you speak now so you can...
Could you speak, please?
Can you hear us now?
Yes, much better.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Albie. I was just saying thank you very much for being so flexible and stepping into the breach here. So if you want to start your presentation.
I'll start right now.
Thank you.
And I don't know who I'm speaking to.
So sorry.
I guess.
Sorry, so I'm Emma Sheeran, I'm the chair, and we've got Michelle McIlveen in the room as well, and then we've got 2 members joining us by video conference, Mark H. Durkin and Joan O'Dowd.
Okay. And in a way, although I've done a little bit of homework on you, I don't know who you are, who's on which side, and that's an advantage. And you know, when I was just back from exile, I was attached to 2 universities in Cape Town. The one was the University of the Western Cape, that was set up for people of colour. It was called the Bush University. And the other was the University of Cape Town. Kate O'Regan was a professor there at UCT. And I was invited to give a talk on a Bill of Rights to each one of them. And my papers are at the University of the Western Cape. My heart and soul was there. University of Struggle, the University of the Oppressed, university that had fought hardest for the rights of the people. But I'd done my BA LLB at the University of Cape Town. Culturally, I was very much associated with it. And I had to speak to each on a Bill of Rights. And it was so different. When I spoke to the black students, a Bill of Rights to them meant freedom, opportunities, changing society, a future, hope. The next day, I speak at the University of Cape Town, a small quota of black students, but overwhelmingly white. And a Bill of Rights to them meant, well, democracy is coming to South Africa. We're going to have changes, but we're not going to be driven into the sea. We can go along with the changes. And it was a very good discipline for me. I couldn't have 2 versions of the Bill of Rights. One to say to the black students, don't worry, people, everything will be unto you through the Bill of Rights. And then the next day say, don't worry to the white students, don't worry, the Bill of Rights will protect you from being driven out of your homes and driven into the sea. It had to be a Bill of Rights for the nation. And I had to give, in essence, the same talk to both groups. Now, I don't know if I was a storyteller before I developed an Irish connection, but I've become a big storyteller. Before getting onto the particular aspects of the South African Bill of Rights, a couple of just quick stories. The one, I've been stateless for 6, 7, 8 years in London, having lost my passport when I went into exile from South Africa. And I've applied for a British passport so that I can travel. And I'm visited by somebody who's from the special branch. And I think, well, is he going into all the underground resistance work that I did in South Africa? Very plausible, you know, somebody you see in a smiley movie, very friendly. And suddenly he says, and Mr. Sachs, what do you think about the Queen? I was like totally astonished. Why is he asking me about the Queen? I don't have very strong views. I happened to grow up in a family that historically was anti-monarchist in South Africa, but the Queen was something the British people liked, mostly, some didn't. You know, why is he asking me this? So I didn't give a quick answer. I must have looked very, very suspicious. But I didn't give an answer. I didn't have an answer. I didn't have views on the Queen. Afterwards, I thought, why was he asking me this? And then I realized I'd actually sat as a commissioner on an unofficial commission of inquiry into the shootings by British troops in the Bogside. That was before the Bloody Sunday event with Lord Gifford. I was then teaching law at the University of Southampton. I was invited to sit on the inquiry, and sadly my South African experience was useful because we'd had many shootings into crowds in South Africa, and I'd been a party to that report. And they must have wondered, did I have some special connections with IRA? So that's the one story. We fast forward to 1988, and I'm in Lusaka, and the ANC Constitutional Committee are having what we call an in-house seminar. I think we must be the only revolutionary movement in the world in human history that has an in-house seminar with a capital I, capital H, capital S, and it was on constitutional guidelines for a future South Africa. And my task was to explain to about 70 delegates, they were people from the ANC resistance army of Umkhonto we Sizwe, they were diplomats, they were students, people living in exile, why we needed a Bill of Rights in South Africa. And my heart was beating. About 70 people in the room, maybe 3 or 4 whites, a few people of mixed descent, overwhelmingly black African people, in the struggle against apartheid. And my heart is racing. And I say we need a Bill of Rights for 3 reasons. One, it makes us look good. We're not these bloodthirsty revolutionaries wanting to seize power. We're speaking about a Bill of Rights. Everybody agrees, okay. That's the tactical reason. I said, more fundamentally, it's the answer of our organization to group rights in South Africa. And at that stage, the whole apartheid system was based on not rights for people, but rights for groups. And if they were willing to move, even to have a universal franchise, they wanted to ensure that the outcome would be group rights. We would have had 3 presidents, one representing white, maybe Afrikaans-speaking mainly people, one that would have been de Klerk, one representing the majority in the liberation movement, Mandela, and the other the Zulu-speaking people, Buthelezi. and they would have rotated their presidency and shared power. And our answer to that was, we don't want power sharing between racial groups and ethnic groups that would simply give the whites a minority veto and would keep alive race as the foundation of citizenship in our country. We want a universal franchise, equal rights for everybody, and protections would come from a Bill of Rights, not through power sharing, not through consociationism, but through a Bill of Rights. So a Bill of Rights then was central to our whole constitutional project. It wasn't an add-on like the American Bill of Rights, added on to once they'd come together, okay, we will now protect these fundamental rights. It was constitutive of our vision of South Africa. And it's no accident that in our Constitution, the Bill of Rights comes before structures of government. And the whole early part of our Constitution has the preamble, the Bill of Rights, foundational principles, and the Bill of Rights, which I'll speak about in a minute. But I said, and why is my heart beating? Because people understand a Bill of Rights then is strategic for South Africa. But my heart's beating because I say there's a third reason why we need a Bill of Rights. We need a Bill of Rights against ourselves. And we'd seen people fighting nobly for freedom in Africa and elsewhere in the world, and they get into power and then they become authoritarian. And I was worried. It's easy for me, white, lawyer, bourgeois, that term was thrown out. I can speak in those terms. Would they repudiate me? And I saw 70 people in that room, a look of delight in their eyes, because they were worried. We did have bad people in our ranks. We'd seen things that had happened in other countries. So it was these three ideas of a Bill of Rights that became central to our whole project of transforming South Africa from a racist apartheid state into a non-racial and afterwards it said non-sexist democracy. But my last story is 3 weeks after that in-house seminar, I'm blown up. A bomb in my car, I lose my arm, sight of one eye, I wake up in hospital, and I feel triumphant and joyous that I've survived. That moment you're waiting for as a freedom fighter, will they come for me, will I be brave? And I got through, I felt triumphant. And to this day, that was 1988, I still have a bit of that triumphant feeling inside me. And as I got better, my country would get better. That was a total conviction that I had. And after I'd recovered, I set up a constitutional study center in London. I'm recovering in the London hospital. Mozambican doctors that saved my life. And one day, there's a knock on the door, and very British voice says, Professor Sachs, may I speak to you? I've just come from the Long Creche prison in Northern Ireland. I've been in touch with the editorial group of the Sinn Féin publication, and they've read your book, The Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter, and they've had a very serious debate. Is it permissible for a freedom fighter to cry? And I'm actually very moved by that. And he told me by a majority of 3 votes to 2, they decided it is permissible for a freedom fighter to cry. Now, it sounds like a very trivial thing, but in fact, the 3 were the 3 who, Lawrence McCowan was one of them, as it turned out, who moved towards negotiations and finding a settlement. And the 2, I think, were the old-time militants who felt it's not appropriate to cry. So I say this because I have a very strong, if you like, emotional, almost existential connection with Northern Ireland. I was very delighted when I was asked to participate. And I have spoken previously, I think at Queen's University many years back, about a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. It might have even been before the Good Friday Agreement. Seeing a Bill of Rights as not simply, at that stage, it was seen as a mechanism to enable Catholics to participate in public service, in the police force, in getting entry to areas where they felt they're being excluded. And so the Bill of Rights was seen as very much something for the loyalists, if you like, to be resistant to. And I was thinking, it can be that. It must be for equality. It must be for breaking down the caste-like features of public life. But it can be much more than that. It can be a system that actually, a Bill of Rights, if properly framed and understood, could be very protective to people who saw themselves as Protestants, who allied themselves with Britain, in terms of an expression of their identity and their culture. And if people could feel protected in the identity and culture, they didn't need to use, and they wanted to march, and they wanted to play their whistles, whatever it is, and bang their drums. It was part of who they were. They'd grown up in it. If that could be done, and it didn't mean jobs, it didn't mean the police force, it didn't mean walls, it just meant that's who we are, we want to do it. People could be protected in that sense through a Bill of Rights. In other words, accepting a Bill of Rights didn't mean being overrun, didn't mean being diminished. It meant opening up, not running away, not being put into a corner. Nobody was comfortable with that idea at that stage, because the loyalist, if you like, grouping still felt a Bill of Rights would be hostile to them. And the Republican Sinn Féin people felt, we don't want to give them rights. They've been oppressing us all this time. But nobody said that. I was a visitor. They were kind of polite. But I really feel that you have an opportunity now to embrace a concept of a Bill of Rights that goes beyond simply clause 1, 2, 3, 4 that protects you against this, that, and the other. Using it in a way that can help people feel comfortable in the country they're in. And it might be, and this is completely unsolicited, but I'm going to offer it anyhow, that a preamble could be as important as a text. Preambles are not things that the British legal system is very comfortable with. It gets beyond the strict letter of the law, it simply introduces the law. But we found crafting our preamble was exceptionally important for our Constitution. And we actually found now, Albie as the judge speaking, the preamble played a very important role in interpretation. So the preamble establishes the value system and to a certain extent the historical moment in which the Bill of Rights is now being, or the new constitutional arrangement is being established. And if you can get a kind of a broad consensus on this is the kind of country we feel comfortable living in, expressed in the preamble, this is why we need a Bill of Rights. This is what a Bill of Rights can guarantee in the broad sense. Then I think it establishes a tonality, a framework, a vision that is comforting, reassuring, and helpful. And it means you don't fight over every single word in the text because you're scared if you give away on this, somehow you're going to let your side down, somehow you're going to be diminished. So I don't know if Kate, my colleague Kate O'Regan, told you about our two-stage process of constitution making. Did she? We had an interim constitution and a final constitution.
Yeah, in her presentation she covered that, yeah.
Okay, so you'll be familiar with that. The interim one was to get a constitution that would be drawn up by an elected body within a framework of principles agreed to in advance. And it was a very wonderful assembly that drafted our final constitution. And it's held up as, in many ways, one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. And these were people in Parliament debating, arguing. Half of them had been to jail, been in exile, many had been tortured, many were from the other side, from the ranks of the, what we call the oppressors. There were other people in the middle, different faiths and backgrounds, and together they drafted this constitution. And it's got a number of features now. 1996, which is the first constitution in the world to include no discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation. It was, I think, the first constitution in the world to constitutionalize environmental rights. It has a very exceptional section dealing with freedom. It's freedom and personal security. And this was strongly influenced by the strong women's caucus in the Constitutional Assembly, who connected up freedom as absence from restraint, arbitrary restraint in terms of detention, no detention without trial and so on, freedom from torture, but also freedom from violence from public or private sources. Maybe the first, maybe the only constitution in the world that, in effect, prohibits gender-based violence as a constitutional matter, not simply as a criminal law matter. It also includes freedom to make decisions on reproduction. So these are not women's rights. These are included as rights of freedom, security. It's something that might be worth looking at and considering. I personally feel it's a very strong woman's voice saying, what are the things that make us as women not feel free? And the two big issues are violence in the home, on the one hand, and secondly, we're not free to make choices over reproduction. The other clauses in that relate to that. That was a very interesting particular element. We had a debate, and I remember Kate was involved in it, and I think we were on different sides beforehand. Should we have just a general clause in the equality provisions, or should we specify? And the academics, I think including Kate O'Regan, said, let's have a general clause, no unfair discrimination, and leave it to the judges to develop. And I strongly resisted that. I said vulnerable groups don't want to be dependent on litigation, on parliament. They might be unpopular groups. Their voices are often not very strong. They want to feel recognized and identified, particularly fundamental rights. So we have a very expansive set of equality, unfair discrimination rights. I won't read them all now, or maybe I can read them all now. So it's equality. Everyone is equal before the law. and it's the right to equal protection, benefit of the law, and then affirmative action is allowed, and then the grounds of unfair discrimination that are prohibited include race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, and birth. And I would argue in favor of comprehensive statements like that, and they're not exhaustive. It just helps to protect those groups that otherwise might be left out. But it does more than that. It gives a sense of dignity. And I think this is a major element of the Bill of Rights. It's not just protections. It's saying, who are we as a nation? Who are we as a people? Who matter? Who count? And that's where the preamble becomes so important. And I'm going to read the opening parts of the preamble. It's founding provisions. 1. The Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values. Sorry, that's the Constitution, not the preamble. We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. And I would suspect the key issue facing yourselves is being united in diversity and seeing being united as not in conflict with diversity, and diversity not as being in conflict with being united, but each, if properly managed, reinforces the other. And then it goes on, we therefore, through our freshly elected representatives, adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. Improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person, and build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. And then it goes on to say, may God protect our people, Nkosi Sikeleli Afrika Morena Baloku, in the different African languages. And I might say we had a debate about God and placing God in the text. And I, who am very secular and have fought for my right not to pretend a belief I don't have, was the one who suggested we include Nkosi Sikeleli Afrika, God bless Africa, because it's the hymn of our people, it's the hymn of struggle, it's a unifying thing. It brought the nation together. So I don't know if that's within your remit, but if it is, I would encourage you to have something similar that people can pick up and read and say, yes, 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 I'm included, I'm covered by that. And we're having it because we are tired of the conflict and the pain, and we've got to live together. And actually, we really want to get on together. And we want to respect each other and allow people to be different in this thing, Northern Ireland, whatever it is. These are the things that we want and that we desire. And we've got to find a way, some ground rules that can unite us, and something of that kind. I think would be very, very helpful. Then we have something that is unusual in our Constitution, the foundational principles. So they're not in the Bill of Rights and they're not in the preamble. And they're called founding provisions. So the Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values: human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. 2, non-racialism and non-sexism. 3, supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. And 4, universal adult suffrage, a national common voters' roll, regular elections, and a multi-party system of democratic government to ensure accountability, responsiveness, and openness. So you've got your preamble, you've got foundational principles, and then the Bill of Rights, each in a separate section, but each at the beginning of setting out our Constitution. And they are not just words. Sitting up on the court, we found in interpreting the use and abuse of powers, the constitutionality of state conduct, the extent of a law, the limitations to laws and so on. We found these principles exceptionally helpful. And it didn't then depend upon what the background of a particular judge was, which side of the struggle you were on. We had a common textual foundation, a set of values that we could draw on and create a new jurisprudence, if you like, drawn from those particular values. I'll just conclude by saying some of the other features of our Bill of Rights, very strong section on children's rights. And again, we had people pushing hard for that. And it's the right not only not to be abused and to have your interests taken account of, but the right to develop and be respected and have a name and identity, very strong. In South African conditions, the land question was vital. So apart from the rights to a fair trial that are very extensively set out, the second largest provision in our Bill of Rights deals with land, with restitution of land, compensation for land. That was very specific to South Africa. We have just administrative action as a constitutionally protected right. I hope that Kate O'Regan spoke about that. It's not often included in the Bill of Rights. And a right to information included in the Bill of Rights. So important for the exercise of other rights, to have a guaranteed right to administrative action. And finally, very extensive social and economic rights. And we drew to some extent on the Irish Constitution, which includes social and economic rights, but makes them direct to principles and not enforceable. And we have made them enforceable. They've played a very important role in our society. Jurisprudence is developing all over the world. It's very strong in Latin America on social and economic rights, particularly health rights, but rights of indigenous people, rights of migrants, the right to education, the right to food, all of these things are included and have become a very important part of the work of the courts in ways that don't detract from the role of government to govern and raise taxes and spend the money well. It's just certain core principles that bring the courts in through progressive realization of rights within available state resources. So you don't go to court to say, I have a right to a school place under the Constitution or to a hospital bed, but you have a right to call upon the state not to diminish these rights where they exist and to facilitate advancement to rights where they don't exist. It was absolutely vital, and I'm really finishing my presentation now, in the Treatment Action Campaign case, where our government was refusing to roll out access to antiretrovirals on a comprehensive basis to women living with HIV about to give birth. And the Viropene would reduce the transmission of the virus by 50%. Now it's 95%. And the government said we have to experiment in 2 sites in 9 provinces only. And we said that was a violation of the right of access to health. And it transformed the whole approach of government to antiretrovirals. We now have the biggest antiretroviral program in the world. The courts, in that sense, upheld something that dealt with human dignity. And we found the theme of human dignity is the one that links up the preamble, the foundational principles, and the Bill of Rights. More than freedom, more than equality, human dignity as the central notion.
Albie, thank you very much for that. I'm sure everybody would agree that was really, really interesting. If I can begin with the first question, I know you referred there to your time in Ireland, and you obviously have a bit of knowledge of the conflict situation that we had here. And obviously, I'm getting from you that you feel that a Bill of Rights was a very important factor in ending the conflict in South Africa. And I just wonder what advice you would have for us here, because obviously we're in a situation where we have had a peace agreement in the North now for 22 years, and the Bill of Rights at that stage was set out as something that we would have, but we still haven't got consensus on a Bill of Rights, and we're not, this obviously is a committee that's set up to consider the creation of a Bill of Rights, and there are some who don't feel that it does have merit. I'm just wondering what advice you would give and how worthy you feel that a Bill of Rights is in a post-conflict situation.
No, I would say go to people and say, what do you want? What are you scared of? And then how can we find common language? So it's partly getting people to feel involved in the process of getting the Bill of Rights. When I say, what are you scared of? I don't mean what are you scared of from a Bill of Rights. What are you scared of living in this country? What oppresses you, or what are you fearful might happen in the future? And how can we guard against that? And then for people to really think of each other as human beings and acknowledging the fears of others. In our case, it was often quite hard for Black people to acknowledge the fears of whites who'd been oppressors, who'd behaved often in a terrible way, both in terms of taking the land and insults and oppressing the languages and in all sorts of ways. And now they want a Bill of Rights. And the feeling they want a Bill of Rights because they want to hang on to everything. And those of us struggling for these notions, and fortunately we had the support of our leadership, would say, the whites are also oppressed by their history and their past. They're trapped in a narrow vision of things. And they're human beings. And they want their language. They want their culture. They want their beliefs. They want to be able to go to church on Sunday and worship in the way that they've always worshipped. Okay. It's almost starting with the very simple things. and then distilling out of that the texts. You don't start with the text and say, are you happy with this or happy with that? You start with the human heart, the human soul, the human aspirations and fears, and then try and distill something out of that. You know, when I spoke to ex-political prisoners, been about 15 years ago, it was very extraordinary. I couldn't tell the difference between, they were all in one room, between the Republicans and the Loyalists. They all seemed to be tough, working class Northern Irish men. So similar in body language and humor and interaction, and yet they've been trying to kill each other, literally, to blow each other up. And here they all were all in the room. And there was also almost a strange connection. They'd all suffered, they'd all been in prison, even on different sides. But I felt the connections between them were very strong. And it's trying to find those connections between people and to build on that.
That's, I suppose, it's a very human thing at the end of it is essentially what you're saying, and just finding the commonality and what links us and connects us as, I suppose, just 2 or 3 or 4 sides of one community. But I wanted to ask, you referred to the preamble and how important you thought that was. We're in the process now where we're potentially going to be doing like a public consultation on a Bill of Rights, and reaching out to the general public and asking what rights mean to them. I'm wondering how you think we can effectively do that in terms of setting out the context, or whether that's worthwhile, or what way we should be doing that in order to get the views of people correctly.
I would very strongly urge you to have a preamble, come up with a text or alternative texts that establishes the tone, the direction, the feel, and it locates it in your history, and why it's in a sense so important to have this document. It's not just when you're in trouble and you're feeling you're being treated unfairly, you can go to court. It's more saying, who are we as people, as human beings who've been in conflict, who are tired of the conflict, who want to establish the commonalities, and that people on the different sides could identify with and say, yes, I'm recognized in that. I was very saddened when I went, I think it was to Longkesh, and the idea then was to do what we've done in Johannesburg. We converted the old Fort prison, where Gandhi, Mandela, and others were locked up, into the site of our constitutional court. And it's very powerful. And we wanted to do something similar with Guantanamo Bay. For various reasons that failed. And could that be done with Longkesh? And Longkesh as a site of pain, of resistance, of survival, if you like, and where Republicans and loyalists have been locked up, and people could go there respecting the suffering of the past, but getting beyond it, being transcendent. But it seems the local council wasn't ready for it then, emotionally ready. And it could have been a very wonderful tourist site and a site of reconciliation. So it's finding those commonalities in the language, the tone, the setting for what follows, and then asking people themselves to write in what they would like in the preamble, to feel proactive about that. So you might ask people, what are your views on same-sex relationships, or what are your views on other areas that have caused controversy? And that's all also useful. but I think it's most useful to get people to start identifying from the very beginning with a preambular text.
That's helpful. I just have one last question around, obviously, South Africa protects cultural rights, and you made reference again there to the importance of that in our context. I wondered how important do you think it would be for us to have something around linguistic, cultural heritage rights?
Yes, I should have spoken about that, because united in our diversity, it's that tension runs right through our whole constitutional structure. Our first objective was to bring the country together from the divisions of apartheid, the Bantustans, separate areas, segregation, group areas. We had to have a united country. So unity comes before diversity. Diversity was apartheid, was separateness. But it's unity not through compelling everybody to subordinate themselves to a single theme or stream into which they have to assimilate. It's a unity across difference, a unity that allows for multiplicity of political views, of languages, of religions, of beliefs, and that's strongly expressed in our Bill of Rights. So we have, in fact, also a separate clause dealing with language rights. It's not in our Bill of Rights, it's not in the foundational principles, so maybe that's a fourth element. And we have 11 official languages, and then that's disaggregated into languages used at national level, provincial level, local level, and then we have languages in education, languages for broadcasting in different areas. Then we have languages that are used by communities that don't have an official status but have a right to be developed. And these would include 4 or 5 languages of Indian origin, and I think Italian, German, Portuguese are languages of particular communities. Then we have sign language is actually protected in our constitution, and 3 languages of religion, Sanskrit, Hebrew, and Arabic. So it's a very comprehensive clause, and we set up a pan-South African language board, not representing delegates from each language, but with a view to ensuring that there would be multilingualism and across-the-board provisions. So I think that's something that ought to be looked at. But in addition, in the Bill of Rights, I did some research when I was in London before going back from exile. I went to the Minority Rights Group, and there was a guy, Cedric Thornbury, was the head at that stage. And I was kind of very puzzled because I felt very identified with everything they were saying, except in South Africa, the minority were the whites, who behaved like a majority, and the majority were the blacks who were treated like a minority. So protecting minority rights in South Africa would have ended up protecting white privilege, which we couldn't go for. But we could protect the Afrikaans language, the Dutch Reformed Church, the religion, and I discovered in the United Nations section there was a resistance to strong protection of minority rights as such, mainly from Latin American countries, worried about indigenous groups breaking away. This was now several decades ago. I think opinion has changed since then. But a right of people to associate, to come together, to use and develop their language, their culture, religion, and that's very clearly expressed in our constitution. Quite extensive rights relating to religion, and it's one set relating to conscience and belief, but also to provide some degree of acknowledgement to well-established religions being able to have a certain sphere within the national sphere, a certain sphere of autonomy in terms of practicing their religion, but also in terms of family law and other areas like that.
Brilliant, Albie, thank you very much. I'm sorry to have to do this, but we've lost Mark H here. So if everyone doesn't mind staying on the call, and we're going to just to suspend for a couple of minutes to see if we can get Mick, because he's apparently joining us at 3 o'clock. So we can't take any more questions.
No, if we can suspend and try and
Okay,
come back.
Albie, I'm really sorry about this. Are you okay to hang on for a couple of minutes?
For me,
Yes.
you'll have to close it down to shut me up.
I thought you couldn't understand my accent there. I was worried that... So we'll just suspend the meeting for 2 seconds, for 2 minutes.
Committee room 29.
We are live again. So, Michelle, if you have any questions for
Yeah,
Albie.
no, thank you very much, Albie, for the presentation. And it's really just sort of following on from the initial question which the chair asked, just with around the issue of consensus. Last week we received a very interesting presentation from Dr. Amanda Cahill-Ripley, who carried out a piece of research amongst Protestants along the border, and obviously their perceptions in relation to human rights. And she states that, sort of contrary to public perception, that the Protestant Unionist community actually aren't opposed to the idea of human rights, but their issue is primarily in relation to the way in which rights are perceived to have been implemented in practice, along with how they've been framed in political discourse in the past, and also their association with being perhaps more pro-Republican or being anti-state. So really, while I appreciate the comments that you have made, and you've talked about having a common language in order to bring people on board, really we're working against that type of context. So what would your advice be in relation to that?
Well, if you can shift the inquiry away from what do you think about human rights, what do you think about a Bill of Rights, to saying what do you want, what are your concerns, what are those things that are so important to you that you feel ought to be protected, then you end up with the rights. And so rights are not seen as a weapon that's used by the other side or that threatens you. So it's just framing the inquiry a little bit differently.
Okay. I suppose really then just to look back to your own circumstances in South Africa, to what extent has there been any tensions between individual rights and the rights perhaps of groups and communities? Because you referred back at the very beginning of your presentation about group rights as opposed to
Yes.
individual rights.
Right. We have a concept in South Africa. I don't know if there's anything in the culture from your part of the world that's similar to that. It's called Ubuntu. Has that term ever been used with yourselves?
Sorry?
Ubuntu. It's very strong in African culture. And basically it says, I am a person because you're a person. I strengthen my humanity if I acknowledge your humanity. It's a theme of interdependence. And we found that the term was used in the epilogue to our interim constitution that helped to set up our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I mention that because the concept of Ubuntu helps to reconcile the individual rights, the rights of autonomy, personal autonomy, individuality, with collective rights, rights in the community. And it means instead of them being hostile, they're seen as mutually supportive. So when we say human dignity, equality, freedom, it means freedom isn't seen as the right to be on your own, to do what you damn well like with your property, your money, yourself, provided it doesn't injure others. That's a far too limited view of freedom. Our view of freedom would be you enjoy your freedom, you nourish your freedom, you exercise it in groups, together with others, in relation to others, working with others. And what we didn't like about group rights was not that they were collective in nature. We have, I didn't mention that, but very strong workers' rights, because workers had fought very hard against apartheid for changes. We have a strong number of definitions. We don't have women's rights as such in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, but gender-sensitive approach to all the elements of the Bill of Rights, seeing women as a half plus, a little bit plus of our community society who historically and in practice have been subjected to particular forms of marginalization and wrong. That can only be understood in that collective historical sense. So we're not against, and children share a number of difficulties as children. So it's not a view that's hostile to looking at rights in a collective way, but it's seen as getting the correct balance between the individual autonomy on the one hand, and the fact that you develop your autonomy in a collective setting through schooling, through community, through neighborhood, through language, through associations, through literature, through music, in all sorts of ways. And my approach has been dignity as the connector. So instead of having a purely libertarian approach or a purely communitarian approach, I argue for a dignitarian approach that links up the libertarian and the communitarian.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Michelle. We'll go now to the members that are linked with us via Starleaf. So, Mike's the Vice Chair. Mike, do you have any questions? I know you didn't catch the oral brief, but you probably had the written brief.
Yes, Chair, thank you very much. And just wanted to say hello to Albie. I met him many years ago. He was in Belfast for an arts event by the Arts Council when he talked about the physical history of the Constitutional Court, which resonated with me because we have an old courthouse on the Crumlin Road in North Belfast, which we could develop along similar lines. But I suppose, Albie, my question is, how important is it to begin a Bill of Rights with a preamble which sets out your vision for what you want for all the people of the country, based on values like human dignity, equality of opportunity, or in fact, Ubuntu, as you would call it, where you are?
I wouldn't say it's important. I'd say it's fundamental. It's crucial. It's the springboard for everything that follows. But you've got to get the right language. And it mustn't be legal kind of language. Legal language can be very sterile, cold, impersonal, and that's part of a strength of legal language. But this isn't an insurance document. It's got to have a poetic ring to it, a sense of humanity. It's got to reach the soul as well as the mind. And it's not easy. You don't want to be all flowery and so thin and airy, but it mustn't look like the beginnings of an insurance contract or a rental agreement.
And from that then flow the rights that you are going to enshrine in statute.
I'm not hearing you very well.
Oh, okay. Listen, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
John, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yeah, Albie, a very interesting presentation. And what struck me most about it was when you talked about the presentation you give to your ANC comrades, and you were nervous about the presentation. And I think I'm quoting you right when you said, we need a Bill of Rights against ourselves. And I think that to me is fundamental, because those in power fall from power, majorities turn into minorities, and the world evolves constantly. Even as elected representatives now, we have a certain amount of power, and I think we need to protect ourselves, or protect against the abuse of that power. So it's really in terms of what you said, in terms of selling this, or not selling it, convincing those people who are sceptical about the Bill of Rights, that but they see that as a loss and a victory for the other side. And you've talked about the use of language, you've talked about reaching out to people, and engagement. But we've been doing this for 22 years, and there's been political reasons, and sometimes immovable objects that resist you when you're trying to make change. But unless we convince people, I fear this project will go on for another 22 years. So maybe it's more advice than a question as to how we continue this journey.
Okay, let's say I'm not a Republican and I'm not a loyalist. I'm Albie from outside. And I'm speaking to loyalists. And I'm saying, Bill of Rights, it's going to protect you. It's going to enable you to be who you are, who you want to be. I'm assuming you don't want to be a bully. I'm assuming you don't want to beat up other people. I'm assuming you don't want to get jobs just because you are of particular faith. I'm assuming you want to get on with your life and have your festivities and recognize your ancestors and others and so on. And the Bill of Rights will give you that right. And it won't be an act of grace, because it'll be a right in terms of your culture. It might require setting up agencies, institutions to ensure particular respect for things of that kind. I think it's always useful to draft constitutional provisions when the competing parties are roughly equal in electoral terms. If one side is completely in power and then they're surrendering power, they're going to hang on. But if you don't know how it's going to turn out, then that's a good time. You feel this is going to protect all of us on all sides. The other point I'd make was, it's not only that majorities become minorities, sometimes bad things happen to the most wonderful people. And we've had bad experiences in South Africa of people who were noble, who were in prison, who fought for freedom, and sadly became, by all evidence, very corrupt afterwards. So the Bill of Rights represents that set of standards. It's not dependent on individuals. It's not presupposing that every president is going to be a Mandela. It's there. It's the kind of world that people like Mandela wanted to create, the norms and the standards. So that's why I say, if you can change the discourse a little bit and the nature of the inquiry to get people to come up with their anxieties and their hopes and the sort of things that can make them feel, yes, I'm living in this part of the world, I'm not being unduly disturbed, I'm getting on with my life, I'm free to feel the way I am. It might be how I worship on Sundays, it might be how I march. Marches become so symbolical. So you don't prohibit the march, you change the sting of the march, you change the meaning and associations of the march, but you allow people to celebrate a form of identity. And now I'm putting my foot in it now. I don't know from even which side you're on. I've got my intuitions, but that doesn't matter. So it's the starting off point is different. It's to make everybody feel, yes, this is my constitution, these are my rights, I'm respected in it, and not this is a weapon that can be used against me by somebody else.
Well, I'm on the side of the Bill of Rights because I think you summed it up, and I started this conversation with you about we need a Bill of Rights against ourselves, and that's why I favour a Bill of Rights. Thank you very much. A very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thanks again, Albie, and thanks for being so accommodating there with all our technological hitches. I believe you want to stay on and listen to Baroness Kennedy's presentation, so I think the team are going to move you into the audience if that's all right. And just thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Appreciate it.
That's right, I'd forgotten. When does she start?
We're hopefully going to go right into that now.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much. So, members, the next item, so we're working in reverse here, so we're going to agenda item 2, and we've got Baroness Kennedy of the Shaws, who is going to present us on a Bill of Rights for the North, and Baroness Helena Kennedy, QC, is a renowned barrister, human rights advocate and broadcaster. So, Baroness, welcome to the meeting, and can I start out by apologising for the delay. I believe that you were online, it wasn't showing you here, so there was an issue on our side, technological difficulty, so apologies for that, and thank you very much for your patience and for staying with us. So if you want to begin your presentation.
Well, first of all, it's no hardship listening to Albie Sachs. Because he is in the world of rights and the world of bills of rights, he's an iconic figure who really did recognise that often nations need things that can actually speak to their aspirations and to the better part of people's selves. And if anyone can write about law in the language of poetry, he can. I actually do share his, I'm very sympathetic with his view that a Bill of Rights is important in nation building. And I'm going to go back and tell you all about why. But I also want to say that I think that do listen to his words, because his experience is, I think, of value to us here in the United Kingdom. And I always invoke him, and I was thrilled to be here to have the opportunity of listening to him. Now, I wanted just to tell you that I as a very young lawyer, spent time in the United States of America. And I did work in a law firm which did a lot of work using the American Bill of Rights. And so my experience of seeing rights becoming a tool in the hands of ordinary people really came from there. And so later on, in the late 80s, I was one of the people in the UK who got together with others to argue for constitutional change. And the constitutional change that we were calling for was that there should be devolution, that there should be a Bill of Rights and a written constitution. We were calling for a Freedom of Information Act so that people could be better informed, because you need information to be able to be a real participant in a democracy. And that we should be reforming the House of Lords and, of course, the committee structures in the House of Commons at Westminster, but that the peoples of our nations should all be making decisions much closer to home. So there were this whole range of things that we were advocating, and we had this charter, Charter 88, and I became the chair of Charter 88 from 1992 until 1997. And and people often say to me, how did you end up in the House of Lords? And the true answer is I ended up in the House of Lords because I'm a lawyer. I'm not I wouldn't describe myself as being tribally political. I am a progressive person. I like to think I'm a left of centre person. I believe in social democracy, but I also believe in the institutions of law, and I believe that that law can be an abuser of people. People can use law to do terrible things to the lives of people in the hands of authoritarians. Law can be a real weapon, but in a Bill of Rights, you're trying to kind of, if you like, shift that power and put some power into the hands of citizens, both as groups and as individuals. And I love the way that Albie described that business of having to balance in the way that I don't think works as successfully in the United States, but balancing collective community rights with the rights of individuals, and neither taking the complete ascendancy. So why do I think that a Bill of Rights is a good thing for Northern Ireland? And the paper that I sent in advance advocates it. Well, first and foremost, I mean, it's like all these things. The agreement, the Belfast Agreement, Good Friday Agreement, that was the product of really hard negotiation and discussions, and for me it was one of the great moments because I had been, I'd done trials in London and other parts of the United Kingdom relating to the Troubles, and I saw the toll it took on many different lives of people who became victims of bombings, but those who were unfairly tried, and where there were miscarriages of justice. But I mean, the whole range of things, the horrors of what it did to the lives of people in our world. And I just felt that to put together and to create a Bill of Rights in Northern Ireland that was protective of all the communities, all of the citizens of Northern Ireland, seemed to me vital. And of course, it made perfect sense to me that part of the prospectus for change and for the future going forward would be a Bill of Rights. And I want to echo something that has been said by Albie, which I really is at the heart of my the paper that I sent through to you, which I kept rather simple and concentrated on what I thought were the difficult issues here. The difficult issues are that, of course, when you're trying to if you like, renegotiate relationships. Which we've been doing, for example, between men and women in our marriages and in our intimate relationships. When you're trying to do that, it can be very disturbing to what people have come to know, and there are anxieties about how a redistribution and a kind of, if you like, a fairer distribution of rights might, in some ways, leave some people feeling that they would be the people who would become vulnerable. And I feel very strongly that actually the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, those who feel very strongly that they're British, this is a protection for people who feel that too, particularly as we're leaving the European Union. I would have thought that this is a moment where it's really important for all sections of the community to feel that their rights might be protected and they have avenues of challenging things that might take place, and as individuals and as communities. And so a Bill of Rights is actually going to be really important as you go forward, as we go forward. And so for me, one of the crucial things is, how do you deal with the anxieties of people who see it as putting power in the hands of those whom they've felt very threatened by, and that can be on both sides. I always remember that when I went into the House of Lords, having basically given a plank of the manifesto and worked on it with politicians in the Labour Party. And I went into the House of Lords to help put through the Human Rights Act, the devolution bills, the Freedom of Information Act, etc. And I always remember that when we were having those discussions about having the European Convention of Human Rights incorporated into our law, there was great concern that this was going to actually empower all those ghastly people that the Daily Mail can envisage. That it would be, empowering terrorists, it would be empowering prisoners, it would be putting, and the courts would be inundated with lawsuits from all these, the worst elements of society. Basically, that was how it was being presented. We would absolutely pull the courts to their knees. Well, in fact, the thing that's pulled the courts to their knees has been the taking out of funds from the courts, in my experience. However, what I do feel is that actually that didn't happen. Those fears have not been true. Of course, there are occasions when people bring mad cases to the courts and try and invoke human rights of being, prisoners insisting that they want to have access to pornography or whatever it is. Some case always ends up making the front page in order to discredit human rights. But actually, human rights are things that if you talk to people up and down the country, as I do, and I've spoken frequently in Northern Ireland about things, is that people, if you talk to people here, what they do care about is they want to make sure that they have access to good health care, that their children are going to be educated, that there are basic things that are fundamental to, they think, the well-being of people. But they also do care about, for example, what happens to the elderly. It's very interesting when you start sitting down and talking about these things. It's like the people on the border who say, yes, I actually am interested in human rights. I just don't want to see them being abused and becoming a tool or a weapon, as Albie said, in the hands of people who've made my life uncomfortable. So what you do have to have is a better conversation. And I can't pretend to you that the conversation around human rights has been very good in England and Wales. And I'm involved just now in a thing involving women's rights in Scotland. I'm sitting on an advisory council to the First Minister. And I'm seeing that, in fact, there's sort of less resistance, it seems, in Scotland to the concept of human rights. And what we have to remember is the many ways in which they can be, the access to the courts using a Bill of Rights can be really important for people. Look what happened to Hillsborough, when people lost members of their family and where the whole thing seemed to be sort of pushed under the carpet. And having an opportunity of having a proper inquest, that was what the people called for. And I do think a Bill of Rights could be invaluable to people in their pursuit of justice in Northern Ireland too. But the way in which you can do that, you've had examples of it from Albie about having a better kind of conversation and dialogue and asking people what it is that they want. What if they did have human rights? What is it that concerns them about it? And having a much more compassionate, human sort of conversation and finding ways in which you can deal with it. Now, one of the things that I've said in my paper was that I actually know that even the Commission on Human Rights summons up great hostilities in the minds of some people in Northern Ireland. I looked at the advice that was given by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission as it was asked to do by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And I thought it presented essentially the international standards and all the stuff that you would see in any decent Bill of Rights if you were creating one tomorrow. And of course, it draws on the experiences of South Africa and other places. And I think that what the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission's advice does is it reflects basically international standards, such as free speech and political freedom of political thought, the right to equal opportunity in all social and economic activity, and that's to be regardless of class or creed or disability, gender or ethnicity. So they're listed a bit, not quite as extensively as the list Albie gave us, but pretty fully. And the right to freedom of expression and of religion. And so they cover the kind of, if you like, the broad spectrum that you would expect to find in a contemporary modern Bill of Rights. But there are the additional things that were special to, if you like, the needs of Northern Ireland. And that's what a good Bill of Rights does, is it goes beyond the sort of the standard. It actually goes into what are the particular circumstances of a nation which should be included in the Bill of Rights for them, and they must be the people who put that together. And so in relation to Brexit, I think the following rights and issues have been highlighted and should be addressed, which is the whole business of citizen equality. And people who can, from the unionist community want to feel very strongly that they are still part of the United Kingdom with no rights that are any different from the rest of the UK. And so you want citizenship equality, you're going to want freedom of movement, the equivalence of the rights on the island of Ireland, are going to be sought because that's what the nationalist community would want. They'd want the European Union citizenship rights and voting rights. And so, your Bill of Rights would have to accommodate what are going to be pressing issues as you go forward. And I think that's true for everybody. What the Commission recommended is that public authorities must fully respect, on the basis of equality of treatment, the identity and ethos of both the main communities in Northern Ireland. And that's where you go to get to the nub of this. It's in the granular bit of that. What is it? What are you talking about in there? And it is about the right to culture, cultural identity, and language. And I know that language has been a hotly disputed issue. But they should form part of a Bill of Rights as enforceable provisions in their own right. The emphasis on both communities should not be used to actually sort of, if you like, entrench divisions. We should be really mindful of that, because what one does want is a coming together and a mutual recognition of the importance of each other's dignity and identity. It's that business of the mutuality that's in all of this. My rights depend on your rights and respecting your rights. And so it is about Ubuntu. I wish we had a word for it that worked. Maybe we just pinch it. But this also entails that rights should extend to individuals that don't fit neatly into either communities. I mean, you now have, like all parts of of these islands, is that we have people who are newer arrivals, people who have come to live in our midst, who have enriched our lives in many different ways, and many of them are different because of the colour of their skin, or they're different because of their religions. They're not Protestants or Catholics, and so again, their rights have to be respected, and we have to find ways of ensuring that. And I know that when I was chairing a committee in the House of Lords, we were after the referendum on leaving the European Union, and we were very concerned about the rights of people, both people from Europe living and settled in the United Kingdom, and citizens of the United Kingdom who'd settled in other parts of Europe, and how their rights would be protected as we went forward. And we also looked into the whole business of the business, which is that, of course, there's a special arrangement for our Irish neighbours and their comings and goings into the United Kingdom. But one of the problems is what happens when you're an Irish person but who happens to be black. In the efforts to keep out folk who are not entitled to come in, but who come in via, into Southern Ireland because they're able to do that, and they're a person of colour. As they move up into the north and want to come over to Heathrow Airport, are they going to be stopped? How is that going to be done without, in some ways, invading the rights and protections that there should be for people, for all people who are Northern Irish or who are Southern Irish. It should be noted that in that business of the identities and ethos and aspirations, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission left the meaning of that rather loose for those very reasons. Societies change, and that they should be developed in case law. And I agree with that. I think that is a way to go forward. I think that however, there should be guidelines on what should be considered as identities, ethos, and aspirations. Because leaving it out without guidance might leave room for very narrow interpretations, and I would be very concerned about that. I wanted to also pick up on the Commission's pointed reference to respect, understanding, and tolerance in relation to linguistic diversity. And to this end, it's also imperative for people to have the right to use the language of their choice, not just that they kind of can have it and use it at home, like, you know, Jewish people using Yiddish. You know, I mean, this has to be about more than that. And the Commission recommended that public authorities must at a minimum act compatibly with the obligations undertaken by the UK government under the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages in respect of the support and development of Irish and of Ulster Scots. And to this end, we should be advised that the Bill of Rights should grant equal status to both English and Irish as official languages in Northern Ireland. And I really do think that is going to be important. And it's as well as giving recognition to Irish and Ulster Scots as Indigenous languages by granting them special status, as reflected in the GFA. So I think that is really important, and it's going to be important. Otherwise, I mean, you really can fall into ditches on this kind of thing. The Commission supports this business of on language and on the business of special status for language, and it states that there's also a need to protect other linguistic, cultural, and ethnic minorities so as to prevent the creation or reinforcement of a hierarchy of rights protections. There's always this awful temptation that people have, which is to somehow start creating hierarchies. We're seeing it currently, I'm afraid, in the United States, where there's talk about creating in rights protections, creations of some rights which are somehow going to be privileged over lesser rights, and I think that one should be very careful about doing that. Also of importance is the right of individuals born in Northern Ireland to identify themselves and be accepted as Irish or British citizens as they choose, or both. And I have a very close friend who's a Northern Irish Protestant businessman, and he has two passports. He's got an Irish passport and a UK passport, and he basically has embraced this sense of himself as having these two identities. So I think that it should be noted this provision understands the national identity in terms of citizenship, as opposed to guaranteeing equality of treatment between British and Irish national identities. And so it's essential that this equality is reflected in the Bill of Rights. And so, I mean, the government should have a responsibility and actually a duty, as should public bodies, to promote tolerance, mutual respect, understanding and cooperation amongst all people living in Northern Ireland, irrespective of their culture, their ethnicity, their religion, or their linguistic identity. And they should do that, particularly in the fields of education, culture and the media. Now, there's an issue which is about the taking of oaths. You know, I mean, I remember sometimes when one was doing a case, there would be people who wouldn't, you know, who have problems about, you know, recognising certain things. I mean, I remember having a conversation where, to my surprise, somebody was saying that they wouldn't become a Queen's Counsel in Northern Ireland because they had to take an oath to the Queen. And it had never occurred to me that you know, was going to be problematic. Anyway, but I think that you do have to have sensitivity to these things, and it's a particularly tricky business in Northern Ireland, and no one should be compelled to take an oath in a manner that is contrary to their religion or their belief, or that requires them to express a belief that they don't hold. And I think that you really have to make a special provision to this effect in any bill that you create. Now, I have a particular thing about children's rights, and I think that they should be reflected in your bill, because it's very interesting. It's worth you having a look at what is going on in Wales, because they're much more proactive on children's rights, and they were the first people to have a children's commissioner before other people. And I think that you could actually lead the way on some of this stuff on children. And you should, I think you all recognise, whenever I speak to, come and speak in Northern Ireland, people talk about the burden that's been borne by younger generations, that the transgenerational impact and continuing legacy of the conflict has really had serious consequences on children in Northern Ireland. And I mean, not just the numbers. I mean, I think it was over 300 who were killed, thousands affected as a result of having family and friends killed or injured or imprisoned. And there's a cost to kids of imprisonment. So children have really suffered, and some were themselves subjected to punishment, violence by armed groups, as we know. And so to repair that damage, I mean, I think that there should be ways in which your Bill of Rights could actually reflect that for future generations. So I would be looking for additional protections for your children. So that's really what I wanted to say to all of you. I know that this is hard, and I think that Albie put his finger on it when he said it's how you conduct these things. I mean, it's about how you have the conversation. And listen, don't look to us, because what happened in the UK was, when the Human Rights Act, it was brought into being in 1998. It wasn't, well, when I say brought into being, it was passed into law, but didn't come into being until 2000, because a couple of years was needed to sort of, train up people and to understand what it meant and so on. But one of the problems was that I feel very strongly that the Labour government backed off promoting it, because they were anxious that if they promoted it too much, that it would lead to tons of cases going through the courts and so on. And they got twitchy about getting bad press from the tabloids, and so they got very defensive about something about which they should have been very proud, which was the introduction of the European Convention of Human Rights into our law across these islands. And so I don't take your your way of traveling from that, but have better conversations, and really try to have everyone see that this is for everybody, and that everybody stands to benefit.
Quite an appropriate note to end that on. Thank you very much, Baroness. That was very interesting, and the presentation that you provided us with was useful as well. I just, if you don't mind, want to go into a wee more detail about one of the points that you made in terms of Brexit, and you explicitly laid out the fact that you felt that there would be impacts of Brexit for citizenship rights and for freedom of movement, and obviously there are a couple of prongs to that. So you referred there earlier to people identifying as Irish or British or both, and we've seen, I don't know if you're familiar with the M. D'Souza case, we've seen the example of where it looks like the British government regard people in the north as British, whether or not we ever exercise that British passport right, or ever sort of acknowledge Britishness ourselves. And then the fact that currently in the 26 counties, law enforcement have the ability to check passports for anybody that are from outside the common travel area, and realistically at the end of this year that's going to apply to anyone who is British from the north. And then the fact that we could leave ourselves in sort of where half the population are in a rights deficit, that technically speaking Irish passport holders should have more rights than British passport holders, which isn't fair, but also how can they be accessed. And I just wondered how you would address that through a Bill of Rights. You refer to the fact that, you know, obviously we're here to consider the particular circumstances of the North and the impact of Brexit on our rights, and how we do that through a Bill of Rights.
Well, listen, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I can draft this for you. You've got great lawyers in Northern Ireland who will sit down and battle this one through. But I think that you basically assert the importance of everyone having the same rights, and then your courts are going to have to deal with the challenges that will be made when it becomes clear that there are going to be differentials, and there will. And I think that in some ways, I'm going to be very honest with you. I was not a supporter of leaving the European Union. I believe in multilateralism, and I think that you know, whatever our criticisms, and I had plenty of the European Union, I think that they're our closest neighbours, and we should have struggled on to try and create better relations. However, I think that people were missold what was on offer. And the majority of people in Northern Ireland actually voted to stay in the European Union. It was a minority, albeit it's been a very powerful minority because of the way in which it's supported the Brexiteers who are now in government and who are negotiating our exit from Europe. But I think that it will be your courts. In the drafting of the bill should be stating its commitment to equality and to the rights of citizens being as they ought to be. That British people should be the same across, those who identify as British should be the same across Europe, and those who identify as Irish should enjoy the same rights as the people of Southern Ireland. And that then becomes a problem for the courts. And it's going to be a very, very difficult one, but it shouldn't be a difficult one for you in creating your Bill of Rights, because if you try to create it in anything other than on the grounds of equality, you end up with a hierarchy of rights. And I don't believe that a hierarchy of rights is what rights is about.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I would be in agreement with that point. I'm just going to go to Mike over the video link as the Vice Chair. Mike, if you have any questions.
Ordinarily, Chair, I would, but with thanks to Baroness for an engagement, I'm going to apologise because I have my hospital consultant contacting me in a few minutes. And so, Chair,
I hope you're all right.
I'm fine. I had a procedure a wee while ago, and it's just a kind of follow-up. But sorry, Chair, I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes.
That's okay, Mike. Thank you very much. Michelle hasn't indicated, so we'll go to John. Do you have any questions?
I'm conscious that Mike does have to go and then we'll lose quorum. So just quickly, and I know the Baroness has said she's not going to write the Bill of Rights for us, and I appreciate that position. But in terms of the generational rights, and you mentioned the impact of the conflict on children, and not only the children who suffered during the conflict, but the children who are suffering since, whether it's impact directly on their families or their community or what it may be. In broad terms, how do you think we should approach that in a Bill of Rights?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think that you should be thinking about is thinking of how do we safeguard and the future of these children. And I think the biggest gift that you can give to them is actually one of the biggest gifts you can give to them, as well as loving them and trying to provide them with the care and nurturance and education and so on that they're so deserving of. But I do think that you have to give them a Bill of Rights, because that is one of the ways in which you can secure the future for those who, however they identify. And I don't know about I can't speak for everybody in Northern Ireland. Obviously, everybody is different. But my own children, who by no means, replicas of me. But one of the things I notice about them is that they really are not wanting to limit themselves in the friendships they have. Their friendships cross all divides and all races, and they are very highly tolerant of difference, and not only tolerant, they're excited by it, they're interested in it, they're interested in difference. And I think that the generation that's coming through in Northern Ireland will be no different from anywhere else. And it's like the young who are the people we should be making this Bill of Rights for. And so when we have the conversations, I want us to have it with them too, because I think that the young are those who really will build a better world. So I really do think we have to give them the tools with which they can do that. And as Albie has said, I agree with him about the preamble. I always sort of say that rights and the language of rights should be where law becomes poetry. It's where we should actually speak the language that actually talks to our hearts, because law is about regulating human relationships and between nations, yes, and our relationship with the state. But it's largely about human relations and our humanity. And so we have to find ways that speak to people, and not the arid language that I had to learn when I was a student lawyer. And I do feel that that human rights gives us that. It's where we can actually speak to the better parts of ourselves, whoever we are, wherever we're from, whatever our backgrounds, that somehow we embrace the fact that we're all the same.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Baroness, thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon, and again, apologies for all the holding up, but that's been really, really helpful and interesting, so thanks very much for your time, and the same goes to Albie. Because we're now losing quorum, or we don't have quorum for any committee business, so we'll defer committee business to the next meeting and declare the meeting closed. All right.